Apophis, by J. M. Conradi. Episode 12. Some of the mountain reserve families had purely out of habit, brought fresh food instead of canned food. After a raiding party brought in more fresh produce, in imminent danger of spoiling, 2 days were designated for a mass canning project. There was no way they could afford to use generators for fridges, and the solar panels they collected would not be able to start a fridge. While raiding parties focused on canning needs, such as glass jars and salt, most of the community gathered round gas stoves to can as much as possible. The rest of the produce had to be eaten within a day, so the next day would be a day of feasting. Having missed out on Easter due to the apocalypse, they designated this as an Easter feast to lift spirits. In order to actually sterilize jars, they need to be submerged in, covered by, boiling water for 10 minutes. Gas stoves were used because the night sounds of horror outside their security area reminded them, large-scale fire or smoke, even in the depression in the tabletop summit of the reserve, could attract attention. The boiled water would be recycled thereafter. It took a lot of water in large pots and even one small metal bath, to fully submerge all their jars. Before the raiding party came back successfully, Ion's own hoard of glass jars gave them a useful start for the day. Was raiding still the right word though? All malls were already gutted, there was no rule of law, they never attacked anyone, although they did break and enter occasionally. Canning is a method of preserving that involves applying heat to food, in a closed glass canning jar and removing air from the jar to create a seal. This process stops the spoilage, thus making it shelf-stable. Always begin with a reputable and tested recipe. There is a science behind the amounts of sugar, salt, or vinegar, as well as the processing time for each recipe. None of the ingredient amounts or processing time should be altered, unless the recipe says you can. Many tried and tested recipes can be found in the Ball's Blue Book of Canning, which Ian had bought 10 days before the apocalypse. Everyone was now reading it as if it was a popular novel. Wash and sterilize your cutting board, knife, or any other equipment you will use to prepare your recipe. Use ripe, unblemished produce for preserving. This will ensure that your finished product will not only taste delicious, but will have the right color, and eliminate any bacteria living in the spoiled part of the fruit or vegetable. Wash all produce in warm water with a food-safe detergent before cooking it according to your chosen recipe. Your produce can be contaminated with bacteria, viruses, and parasites at any point from the garden to your table. This will keep your food safe from contaminants before you start canning. In a small saucepan, keep the rings and lids in hot water until needed. Don't underestimate the speed by which contamination can slip in. Leave the jars in the hot water, until ready to be filled. Add your hot preserves into the jar with a funnel. Leave the appropriate amount of headspace as your recipe recommends, between the top of the food and the level of the lid, for creating a vacuum when food cools down. Wipe down the lip of the jars with a clean towel, and then add the lid and ring. Once processed, let the jars sit undisturbed on the counter, or pot, if pressure canning, until cooled. You will hear the signature ping, once the jar is sealed by the air inside shrinking and creating a vacuum at the top. The lid will be concave, and will not give when pressed. Any jars that did not seal can be reprocessed or refrigerated. Store the jars without their rings in a cool, Dry place. The rings are only needed to alight the lids to the jars, and could be removed before storage. The lids will not pop off, unless the seal is broken. Store the food in a cool, dry place where the seals cannot be interfered with. Always check whether the seal had remained concave, before opening and serving the food. Food poisoning is serious, even more so after the apocalypse without proper medical care and meds. Day D+10, one of the most gruesome postulations made under chaos theory for the unlikely event of an apocalypse, is, the worst kind of apocalypse, would be one that destroyed the world economy but not decimate the human population. When the fires, explosions, tsunamis, and limited nuclear strikes were over, almost 90% of the world's population still survived when global famine struck. Though coups were still ongoing in many countries openly or in secret, the idea of large-scale war and death on a nationalist basis dissipated while governments struggled with inner turmoil, broken infrastructure, and lack of telecommunication. Large-scale conflict in North Korea was largely settled, while it dwindled on disinterestedly between land forces of India, Pakistan, and China. Only in the Middle East did the flame of war still burn bright. Therefore, 6 billion surviving people, many not in a good state of health and mind, began to compete for dwindling resources in the absence of most systems of law, order, electricity, and communication down except for small local pockets. Like most common folk struggling to come to grips with what happened locally in the absence of almost all long-distance communication, Ian was unaware of the global status and scale. However, he could guess much of it because of his years-long interest in the apocalypse. And it had him very worried, even though the hidden mountain reserve community was palpably safer than their house had been. All around them in the distance were worse areas, some of the most densely populated, poverty-stricken dangerous areas of the world. The only exceptions within reach of one tank of gas, were the wild outback in the far north, and the five-star hotels, boutiques, and palaces of the financial district to the south, before the desert. In some countries there were safe open countryside expanses to flee to, but many people did not have that option. This community would have to be prepared to fight for survival together, and he had to discuss their preparedness with the colonel and the council, as soon as possible. Although the White House was still eerily silent after issuing initial emergency rulings, admirals organized the returning Navy into a Pacific and an Atlantic group, both still powerful, to patrol the Pacific and Atlantic coastlines and islands against any possible threat to the waning and silent Republic. They sent out unauthorized but chilling warnings on shortwave frequency to warn any possible aggressors. Most other powerful nations did more or less the same thing, protecting the status quo and a tremulous peace, as the world reeled. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away from that power struggle, their mountain reserve community had a botanist, and several amateur farmers, working on long-term projects for growing food, though Ian was going to discuss with them the need for low-sunlight fungi, and his tray of mushroom seeds. To be continued in episode 13. The hour-long omnibus versions, of 6 episodes per hour, is only available on YouTube. See the link below, it is free. Here is some amateur footage of their farming endeavors, and other details about this series and about this variety channel. masses died, leaving only the lucky, or unlucky, depending on your perspective.
Asteroid Apophis.